On a Tuesday morning in late October, Miriam Holt sat at the kitchen table of her sister's spare bedroom and counted what she had left. $412. She counted it once, stacked the bills in a careful pile, and counted again, not because she doubted herself, but because her hands needed something to hold while her mind refused to accept the number. She was 53 years old. She had been a wife for 22 years, a mother for 19, and a divorcee for 7 months. The house in Clover Hill had gone to the bank. The savings had gone to the lawyers, and the storage unit on Route 9 held everything she owned. 2 boxes of winter coats, her grandmother's china, and a sewing machine she hadn't touched in years. Her sister Bess meant well. But Miriam had been sleeping in this room since March, and the walls had started to feel like they were watching her. When the letter arrived from her late father's estate attorney, she almost set it aside unopened. Her father, Howard Holt, had died the previous spring, quietly the way he had done most things. He had been a shoemaker, not a metaphor. An actual shoemaker in an actual shop, in the small Indiana town of Harlan's Creek, where Miriam had grown up and left the morning after graduation and never once looked back. The letter said he had left her the shop. Miriam read it twice. Then she read the attached property assessment. The Holt Shoe Shop, 14 Canby Road, Harlan's Creek, Indiana. Assessed value, $0. Outstanding back taxes, $6,200. Structural condition uninhabitable without renovation. Recommended disposition, demolition or county receivership. She set the paper down on her sister's kitchen table, and for the first time since the divorce she almost laughed. He had left her the very thing she had run from. A shoe shop in a dying town, appraised at nothing. Owing money she didn't have, falling apart. Her father had left her as failure because it was the only thing he had to give. That was what she told herself. She would spend the next 4 months learning how badly she had been wrong. Miriam hadn't been back to Harlan's Creek in 9 years. The town was smaller than she remembered, or maybe she was just more aware of what small looked like now. 2 stoplights, a gas station, a diner with a hand-lettered sign, the old grain elevator that nobody used anymore, and on Canby Road between a shuttered insurance office and a hardware store that looked like it was thinking about closing, her father's shop. The sign above the door still said Holtz in faded gold letters. The window had been papered over from the inside. The porch step sagged when she put her weight on it. She used the key the lawyer had mailed her and let herself in. It smelled like leather and saddle oil, and something older beneath both. The smell of a place that had been tended for decades by the same pair of hands. The workbench ran the length of the back wall. The tools were laid out in a row, clean and in order. All's lasts, a cobbler's hammer rolls of weld thread on a wooden peg. Everything exactly where it belonged, exactly as if her father had just stepped out for lunch and would be back in 20 minutes. Miriam stood in the middle of that shop and did not know what to feel. She had not come to keep it. She had come to clear it out, deal with whatever needed dealing with, and hand the property back to the county. That was the sensible thing. That was what a woman with $412 to her name did, with a crumbling building she couldn't afford to heat. But she stood there a long time, and something about the order of those tools stopped her feet from moving toward the door. Her father had been a quiet man. She had mistaken that for emptiness. He worked 6 days a week, sometimes 7, repairing the shoes of people who couldn't afford to buy new ones. He charged $4 for a re-soled heel when she was in high school, $6 by the time she moved away. He never raised prices more than cost demanded. He mended children's shoes for free when he thought the family wouldn't notice the receipt was missing. He fixed the same pair of boots for the same old farmer 3 years running without once suggesting maybe it was time for a new pair. Because he knew the farmer had already decided against it, and a good man respects a decision made from pride. Miriam had loved him. She had also spent most of her adult life faintly embarrassed by him. She had married a man who wore cufflinks and talked about real estate. She had moved to a city where nobody repaired anything. You threw it away and bought another. She had understood the world as a place where things had prices, and a man who charged $4 for an hour of skilled labor was a man who had failed to understand the basic economics of his own existence. She had been angry at him for that, the way you are angry at someone for a thing they cannot help. Not loudly. Just quietly for a long time without ever saying so. He had never defended himself. He had only said, when she asked him once why he didn't raise his prices, "The people who can pay will pay. The people who can't, we figure something out." She had told her then husband about that conversation, and they had laughed together. the comfortable laugh of people who believe they have evolved past a thing. Now, she was standing in his shop with $400 to her name. And it was not so funny anymore. The first time she met Theo was the second day she came to the shop. He was sitting on the porch step when she arrived. A boy of about 16, slight, with the careful stillness of someone who has learned not to take up too much space. He had a pair of work boots in his hands, the sole coming apart at the toe, and he was looking at the door with the expression of someone who has not yet accepted that the door will not open. Miriam asked who he was. He said his name was Theo Birch. He said he knew the shop was closed, but he didn't know where else to go. His grandfather's boots were the only pair he had that fit, and school didn't let you in without closed-toe shoes, and his mom had already called 2 places and neither of them would fix old boots, only sell new ones. Miriam looked at the boots. The sole was coming off cleanly. A job her father could have done in 20 minutes. She almost told the boy she didn't know how to do it herself, which was true. But she looked at his face, at the particular combination of hope and embarrassment on it, and she said, "Come back in 2 hours." She spent those 2 hours on her knees on the shop floor with her father's tools and a YouTube tutorial on her phone. And she fixed the boots badly but sturdily enough to hold. And when Theo Birch came back and put them on and walked across the floor, testing the sole boot, something cracked open in her chest that she did not have a name for yet. He left without paying. Not because he was rude. He had offered carefully, the $12 in his pocket. She had waved it off without quite knowing why. That night she sat in her car outside the shop for a long time before driving to Bess's. She had not decided anything. She had only fixed a pair of boots. But she kept thinking about the order of those tools on the workbench. A careless man does not lay his tools out that way at the end of the day. A man who lays his tools out that way is a man who expects someone to use them again in the morning. She could not stop thinking about who he had expected that someone to be. She started coming every day. She told herself it was to sort through the inventory before handing the property over. There was a great deal to sort through. Her father had kept everything, every last, every punch, every scrap of leather he had deemed too good to throw away. She went through it shelf by shelf, and as she went, she found other things tucked between and behind and beneath the leather and the tools. Notes, receipts, cards. Some were formal, "Thank you, Mr. Holt," on drugstore stationery signed neatly. Some were barely legible, penciled on torn paper, the handwriting of someone who was not much of a writer but had something to say anyway. Some were from children, with crayon drawings of shoes. One was from someone who had not written a name, only, "You are the only one who never made me feel small for not having money. That matters more than you know." She found them pressed between ledger pages, folded into the back covers of catalogs, tucked inside the brim of an old cap on the shelf. He had kept everyone. And behind the last shelf on the back wall, she found the ledgers themselves. Now, before we tell you what Miriam found in those ledgers, and what she found will change everything you think you know about a quiet man in a small-town shoe shop, we want to ask you something. If you've ever misjudged someone you loved, if you've ever found out too late that you had the wrong picture in your head, this story is for you. Hit subscribe and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? One comment is enough to help this story reach the person who needs to hear it. Now let's go back to Miriam, standing in the back of her father's shop with the ledgers in her hands. They were ordinary accounting ledgers, black hardbound, the kind you could buy at any office supply store. There were 11 of them, spanning from 1987 to the year he died. She opened the first one expecting columns of numbers, income, expenses, the small arithmetic of a small business. What she found instead were names. Each page was divided into 2 columns. On the left, a name and a date. On the right, a note in her father's small, careful handwriting. Not a dollar amount, a note. March 3, 1989. Lavon Pratt, widow, 4 children. Winter boots, size 7. Resoled and relined. She brought me a jar of apple butter. I told her we were even. October 14, 1991. A man named Carl wouldn't give his last name. Dress shoes, needed them for a job interview the next morning. I worked late. He got the job. He came back 3 weeks later and paid me double and cried a little when he did it, which I pretended not to notice. June 6, 1995. The Darcy girl. Bess's classmate, I think. Wedding shoes. Her father lost his work the month before. I told her the soles were complimentary. She didn't know what that meant, and I said it meant free, because she deserved to walk down the aisle without worrying. Miriam stopped reading. She looked at the wall. Then she found the entry dated the year her own wedding shoes had been made. Her mother's shoes, handed down, which she had brought to her father to be re-dyed and re-heeled before the ceremony. May 2001. Miriam's wedding shoes, dyed champagne, new heel tap, left side. She looked beautiful. I didn't say so because she was nervous and I didn't want to add to it. I should have said so. She closed the ledger. She opened it again. She sat down on the floor of her father's shop and read for 3 hours without stopping. The ledgers were not accounting records. They were a chronicle. 40 years of shoes that had carried people through the moments of their lives. First days of work, funerals, graduations, interviews, surgeries. The ordinary Tuesday errands of people who couldn't afford to start over from scratch. Every pair, every name, every small dignity her father had quietly preserved when he could have simply turned the work down or charged what the market would bear. She found entries for people she had known growing up. The minister's family, the schoolteacher who drove 40 minutes from the next town because nobody closer did good leather work, the veterans at the VFW hall, whose parade boots her father repaired every year without charge and recorded with one line, "Parade boots. They earned it." She found entries from the years when the factory in town had closed and half of Harlan's Creek was out of work. Those pages were dense. He had worked longer hours and charged less, and she could see in the writing that he had understood exactly what he was doing. He was holding the line. He was the one place in town where a person could bring a broken thing and have it made whole again without being made to feel the cost of needing help. She found near the back of the 7th ledger, single line that had nothing to do with shoes. Miriam called today. She sounded tired. The divorce is hard. I don't know how to help her except to stay reachable. I hope she knows I am reachable. She had not called him much during the divorce. She had been too ashamed, too proud, too convinced that he would not understand the world she had built and lost. He had been sitting here the whole time, reachable, waiting for the call she did not make often enough. She set the ledger down. She pressed her palms flat on the cold floor, the way she had pressed them on tables and desks her whole life, steadying herself before a hard thing. Then she picked it back up and kept reading. Because if he had carried these names for 40 years, the least she could do was carry them for an afternoon. She found the boy's letter in the back of the 9th ledger. It was written on a piece of notebook paper, the kind with the red margin line, folded 4 times into a small square. The handwriting was unsteady, the letters larger than they needed to be. "Mr. Holt, you fixed my shoes last winter when I didn't have the money, and you didn't make me feel bad about it. I failed 2 classes and my dad said I wouldn't amount to anything. I thought about not coming back to school. But I had to come back because you fixed my shoes, and it felt like someone thought I was worth fixing too, so I came back. Thank you." No name? No date she could find. She would never know who had written it. She would also never forget it. By the time the afternoon light faded, she had read all 11 ledgers. She sat in the dark of her father's shop, not yet ready to turn on a light, or stand up, or do anything that would move her forward into whatever came next. She had spent 22 years in a marriage to a man who understood price and could not understand worth. She had believed for most of her adult life that her father's failure to charge what the market would bear was a kind of willful blindness, a sentimentality that had kept them poor and kept her ashamed. She had built a life on different principles and watched that life collapse anyway, and now she was here, on the floor of a shop assessed at $0, reading 40 years of proof that she had measured with the wrong ruler. She did not cry the way she expected to. She sat with it quietly, the way her father had sat with things. And she thought, he never explained himself. Not once. He had only done the work, kept the record, and left the ledgers where someone would eventually find them. He had left them for her. She understood that now. He had not known when she would come, or whether she would come, or in what condition. But he had known that if she ever did, she would be a woman who needed to understand before she could forgive, and so he had left her everything she needed to understand. The next person to complicate matters arrived on a Thursday in November, 6 weeks after Miriam had begun spending her days in the shop. His name was Griffin Lowe. He was 45 or so, well-dressed in the careful way of men who want to seem approachable while being powerful, and he pulled up in a clean gray SUV that had no business on Canby Road. He introduced himself as a regional acquisitions director for a company called Landmark Redevelopment Partners. He said it with the particular smoothness of a man who has said it many times. He offered his condolences about her father, in a tone that suggested he had not known her father and was offering the condolences as a procedural matter. Then he got to it. Landmark was purchasing and renovating several properties along Canby Road as part of an effort to, in his words, revitalize commercial corridors in underserved Indiana communities. The Holt building, he said, was ideally situated. He laid a number on the workbench between them like a card from a deck he had never lost with. $60,000. Miriam looked at the number. She looked at the shop around her. She thought of her $412, of the back taxes still owing, of her sister's spare room. $60,000 was a number that could end a certain kind of fear. It was a number that could give a 53-year-old divorced woman something resembling a future. Griffin Lowe had seen that number land before. She could tell by the slight settling in his shoulders, the almost imperceptible relaxation of a man who believes the hardest part is over. Then he looked around the shop with the satisfied expression of someone taking inventory of what he is about to own, and he said, pleasantly, as if he were doing her a favor, that the building would of course be demolished. The whole block was going mixed-use retail. Modern. Climate-controlled. A coffee chain had already committed to the corner unit. He said it the way you say something obvious to someone you don't think will argue. And something shifted in Miriam. Not anger exactly. A kind of recognition. Because she had said the same things about this shop, in her own mind for years. That it was outdated. That it was a relic. That the world had moved past the kind of patient, small thing her father had spent his life doing. She had agreed with Griffin Lowe's entire worldview before she ever met him. And she had agreed with it for 20 years. And now here it was coming at her in a clean gray SUV with $60,000 in its hand. And she found she did not like the sound of her own old convictions from somebody else's mouth. She told him she needed time to think. He nodded warmly, left a card on the workbench, and said she could reach him any time. He added, as he put his hand on the door, gently, regretfully, that she should know the county had already flagged the property for a code enforcement review. Given the structural conditions, if she chose not to sell, she might face a demolition order anyway, and those weren't cheap to fight. It was a threat wearing the clothes of useful information. They both knew it. She thanked him for coming. She waited until the SUV pulled off Canby Road. Then she sat back down in her father's chair behind the workbench, and she let herself think. The money was real. The fear behind it was real. She was not going to pretend otherwise. She sat with it the way she had learned to sit with things since the divorce, honestly, without trying to hurry herself to a conclusion. On one side, enough money to start over, a chance at a life that did not involve sleeping in her sister's spare room or counting $400 stacks of bills on borrowed kitchen tables. On the other side, a shop assessed at zero, a pile of back taxes, and 40 years of other people's names in 11 hardbound ledgers. And Theo Birch, who would have to go somewhere else to get his boots fixed, and there was nowhere else. And the letter with no name, from a boy who had almost not come back, who had come back because someone had fixed his shoes, and it felt like being worth fixing. She thought about Griffin Lowe's face when he had looked around the shop, the way he had looked at the workbench and the tools and the rolls of welt thread and seen a clearing job, a line item, a before picture. He was not a cruel man, she could see that. He was a man who had learned to appraise things in a particular way, and had been rewarded for it so consistently that the appraisal had become the truth. He believed the building was worth $60,000 and not a penny more, because that was the number his spreadsheet produced, and his spreadsheet had never been taught to enter a name. She drove to see her father's attorney the next morning. His name was Vernon Qualls, a compact man past 70 who ran a one-room practice above the pharmacy, the same pharmacy that had stood there when Miriam was a child, which she found obscurely comforting. He smelled of old paper and had the careful deliberateness of a man who has spent 50 years making sure he understood before he spoke. She laid the ledgers on his desk. Not all of them. She couldn't carry all of them, but the first and the last, and the letter with no name. She asked him if there was anything in her father's estate that she hadn't been told about. Vernon Qualls took off his reading glasses, cleaned them, and put them on again. He opened the first ledger, read a few pages, closed it, looked at her over the frames. "Your father came to see me," he said, "about 8 years ago. He had a particular concern. He said that a development company, not Landmark, a different one, though he'd heard Landmark had the territory now, had approached your father about buying the building. Your father had said no. But the conversation had made him think. He'd been watching what happened to small towns, to the storefronts that got bought and flipped, and turned into things that had no memory of what they had been. And he had a worry, your father. Not about himself, he was past 60 by then, and didn't much care what happened to the building while he was still in it. His worry was about after. Vernon Qualls opened his desk drawer and removed a folder. Inside was a document Miriam had not seen. A deed of charitable trust, notarized and recorded at the county courthouse, dated 8 years prior. Her father had established a community preservation trust for the property. The shop and its contents were held in trust for community use, specifically designated as a repair and skills workshop for low-income residents of Harlan's Creek and surrounding communities. Under the terms of the trust, the property could not be sold to a private commercial developer. It could not be demolished for retail construction. It could only be transferred to a qualified nonprofit or maintained by a family trustee, which under the terms was Miriam, as the sole surviving heir. The building could not be touched by Griffin Lowe, not for $60,000, not for $600,000, not ever. Her father had locked the door 8 years ago. He had done it without telling her. He had done it the same way he did everything, quietly, without making it a story and without putting the weight of it on anyone else. He didn't tell me, she said. No, said Vernon Qualls. He said he didn't want you to feel obligated. He said if you came back to the shop and you wanted to keep it, the trust would protect you. And if you never came back, the trust would hold until someone who would do right by it came along. He said, and here Vernon Qualls looked at her with the careful directness of a man who has spent a long time with this particular sentence. He said, my daughter is a capable woman, but I won't put a fight on her shoulders alone. I want the law to hold it so she doesn't have to. Miriam sat very still. For 20 years she had believed her father had not understood her world. It turned out he had understood it precisely. He had seen what was coming, not Griffin Lowe specifically, but the category of Griffin Lowe, the man with the clean car and the smooth condolences and the number on the workbench. And he had spent 8 years making sure that when that man came, he would already have lost. He had not done it for himself. He had done it for her. And he had done it without telling her, because to tell her would have been to make it a debt. Griffin Lowe came back 2 weeks later with a lawyer and a thicker folder. He was still pleasant, but pleasantness had calcified into something harder underneath. He spread the papers on the workbench and began explaining the legal process of property condemnation for public development. Miriam let him finish. Then she put a single document on top of his stack, the charitable trust recorded and notarized, 8 years old. The lawyer picked it up. Read it again. He leaned toward Griffin Lowe and said something quietly. She watched the number leave Griffin Lowe's face the way water leaves a wrung cloth. He tried several more angles. He mentioned that trusts could sometimes be challenged. He mentioned that the code enforcement situation remained a concern. He mentioned, with slightly strained warmth, that the community of Harlan's Creek might actually benefit more from modern retail traffic than from. Theo Birch walked in the door. He had come to drop off his uncle's work boots, which had a broken eyelet. He stopped when he saw the suits took in the room, looked at Miriam. She looked at him. She looked at Griffin Lowe. She said, this is Theo. His grandfather's boots are the reason he makes it to school. My father fixed them. I fixed them. The shop has been fixing boots in this town for 40 years, and there is not one thing in your folder that is going to change that. Griffin Lowe looked at Theo, looked at Miriam, looked at the workbench, the tools, the rolls of thread, the ledgers stacked on the shelf. He was doing the appraisal again. She could see him doing it, trying to find the number that made sense of what he was looking at. He could not find it, because what he was looking at was not a building, it was a promise, and he had never learned to price a promise. He left without another word. She heard the SUV pull off the road. The town went quiet again the way small towns do, not empty quiet but held quiet. The particular silence of a place that knows what it is. The code enforcement issue took 6 months and a legal aid attorney from Indianapolis, who took the case because she had grown up 40 miles from Harlan's Creek and had once had her confirmation shoes resoled at a shop like this one. They won. Word spread through Harlan's Creek the way it always had, through the diner, the hardware store, the church parking lot on Sundays. And then people began coming. Not to buy shoes. There were no new shoes. They came the way people come to a place that has decided to still be what it was. A woman brought in her mother's winter boots, the ones she couldn't afford to replace, and Miriam spent an afternoon relearning how to resole a flat-lasted boot, and did it badly the first time, and better the second. A man brought a leather belt that had broken at the buckle. A girl brought a pair of tap shoes that needed new taps for a recital. Theo began coming after school. He had grown up watching his grandfather fix things, the same way Miriam had grown up watching her father, and his hands already knew the basic grammar of the work. She taught him the parts she knew. He taught her the parts he'd figured out from watching. Between the two of them, they learned faster than either would have alone. She found a vocational instructor from the high school who came in on Saturdays and knew leather work properly, the way a trained person knows a thing. And under her the Saturday sessions became real instruction. 6 students the first week, 14 the week after. Vernon Qualls drew up the paperwork to activate the trust formally, with Miriam as the managing trustee. The back taxes were cleared by a grant from a state small business preservation fund that Vernon Qualls had known about for years and had been quietly waiting for the right application to arrive. The building was rewired and re-roofed by a volunteer crew from a church 3 towns over whose pastor had, 25 years ago, brought his ordination shoes to Howard Holt to be repaired before the ceremony and had never forgotten the bill that wasn't one. None of this was organized. It simply happened the way things happen when a place decides to stay itself. People arrive with what they have, and somehow it adds up. Miriam did not get rich. She did not get the $60,000. She slept in her sister's spare room for 3 more months before Bess found her a rental 2 streets from the shop, small and drafty and exactly sufficient. She learned in those months that sufficiency was a thing she had spent most of her life underrating. She opened the last ledger, the final one her father had been using when he died, and she found that the last third of it was blank. He had not filled it. He had left it for someone. She sat at the workbench one evening after Theo had gone, and the shop was quiet and smelled of leather and saddle oil, the way it had always smelled, and she opened to the first blank page. She did not write a eulogy. She did not write an explanation. She only did what he had done for 40 years. She kept the record going. Theo Birch, age 16. Work boots, broken eyelet, fixed same day. He is learning to set rivets now, and his hands are steadier than mine. November 19. A woman named May did not give her last name. Heels on dress shoes, worn down to nothing. She said she had a job interview in the morning. I worked late. She came back the next week and told me she got it, and I told her that was the shoes talking, and she laughed. She set down the pen. Outside, through the shop window, she could see the low yellow light of Canby Road in the early dark, the hardware store next door, the stoplight, 2 blocks up blinking its patient amber. There was nothing dramatic about it. No river, no lamp on a post. Only a woman at a workbench in a small Indiana town, keeping a record that had never really been about shoes. Her father had spent 40 years in this room, making sure that people who couldn't afford to start over didn't have to. He had written every name down. He had kept every letter. He had locked the door against what was coming, in a way that asked nothing of anyone, but only made the protection permanent and legal and real. And he had left the ledger open. Miriam Holt had spent 20 years building a life on the idea that worth was a number. She had learned better, the hard way, at the age of 53, in a shop assessed at $0, by a man with a clipboard who had looked at the same walls her father had looked at every morning of his working life, and had seen only the price of the timber. Her father had appraised it differently. He had appraised it at 40 years, at 11 ledgers full of names, at a boy who came back to school because someone had fixed his shoes and it felt like being worth fixing. One of them had measured wrong. She turned to the next blank page and left it empty, for tomorrow's name, for the one after that, for whoever needed to be told, without words and without debt, that something broken was worth the time it took to make it whole. She turned off the light and locked the door of her father's shop, and the street outside was quiet, and Harlan's Creek was small. And she had $412, and she had never in her life been more certain of where she was supposed to be.